You can welcome Andris Berzins. Please some applause for Andris. I'm sure he won't like this, but I have to read all his titles, and he's a chairman and co-founder of TechHub Riga, advisory board member of Infogram, and advisory board member and the lead wise guy at Startup Wise Guy. And nonetheless, he is an investor. So everybody who has a startup, approach him. Yeah, it's easy to get money from you, yeah?
Very easy.
Okay, fine. I'd like to ask Andris to come here, take my mic, and tell us everything we need to know about startups and more.
Thank you. So, first thing I have to say is I think I'm going to disappoint everyone with that kind of an introduction, because I certainly don't know everything about startups. But I'm delighted to be here, and I've been in Lithuania a few times, but this is my first visit while I have at least one of my hats on as Creandum. And what I wanted to do was maybe tell you a little bit about my sort of startup story, and through that there are a few key lessons along the way in various different things I've done, which might be useful. So a lot of you might be wondering, what the hell is a guy from Latvia with a London accent doing here? Right? Where is he from? So I'm Latvian by origin, but I grew up mostly in London. Actually born in Sydney, Australia, to make it even more complicated. And I moved to Latvia after independence for a few years in the early 90s when things were really crazy. And then I got into Stanford Business School, which is when I caught the internet and high-tech bug. And actually I was in Stanford Business School around the time that Netscape was fighting Microsoft in the browser wars. So who here knows what Netscape is? Good, it's not everyone. You see, this is showing how old I am, because not everyone has their hand up immediately. This was a great time, obviously. It was the first dot-com boom in the Valley. There was a lot of craziness. Does anyone remember a company called Webvan? Anyone know a company called Webvan? A few of you put your hands up. So if you want to have a laugh and think about how the dot-com boom has been even worse than now, maybe, look up the history of Webvan. This is a company that raised, I think, $2 billion. $2 billion. Did everyone hear that? $2 billion to do online grocery delivery, and they were out of business in something like 2 years. Gone. $2 billion, gone. Right? The head of Accenture left to run Webvan, and he kind of made a fool of himself doing this. So it was a really crazy time. So I spent some time in Stanford. I then did a couple of years of consulting to pay for the education. But then I joined a tech startup, which soon later, I guess, was called Aeroscout. And Aeroscout, many of you may not have heard of. It's a company in the enterprise Wi-Fi location space. So we ended up using Wi-Fi radios to track high-value assets, doing things like tracking medical devices in hospitals, work in process in manufacturing, and shipments in logistics, various things like that. So it was in the RFID business. And I joined Aeroscout before we ever knew about things called Wi-Fi, RFID, and all of that stuff. Because originally, and this is part of the key lesson, is originally when I joined the company, it was two guys who had some engineers who had invented a way of measuring the distance between two Bluetooth radios. Okay, so Bluetooth is today best known for the headsets that connect to your mobile phone. And back in those days, Bluetooth was a very new thing. Ericsson was pushing it like hell, but it was still not adopted at all. And these guys figured out how to take two Bluetooth chips and send a radio signal from one and then back to the other, and using analysis of the time and everything, the radio waves, to figure out roughly how far apart they are. And so we thought we had a great idea for a business. What we were going to do is build a device that a parent would have, like a little phone sort of size device, and then a bracelet that you would put on a child's wrist, right? And of course, parents are really worried about their kids getting lost in a public place. So lots of them would buy these bracelets and this device, and we'd use Bluetooth distance measurement using a standard device, and it would be great, right? So we looked at this market. We spent probably the first year or two researching it, looking at various possibilities of making this work, and it turns out, and I'm the parent of 4 children now, and maybe I'm guilty of the same, parents really are not willing to pay that much for their child's safety, it turns out. And rather it was at that time quite expensive to build this thing. So to cut a long story short, the business that ended up being Wi-Fi location for high-value assets in the enterprise started from a business that was talking about tracking kids and parent safety. So one of the key things you need to remember as you go into a startup is, the end result may be quite different from where you start. And what's key is that during the key years, the core team didn't change. The core team was a team trying to figure out how to build a business, something that had value, something that lasted, something that grew. And that didn't change. We ended up changing a lot about what we were selling to whom. And we did, before Steve Blank had written all these books about customer development, we were kind of trying to do the same thing, trying to figure out who the hell is going to pay something for whatever we're going to build, right? But the path to actually getting there can be a long and different windy path. So that was the first thing, was around how hard it is to predict where you'll end up, and the key thing is to be on the boat with a bunch of people you like working with, you respect, and you want to hang out with and spend a lot of time making it work. So that was one thing in the Aeroscout lesson, and it ended up working. It's actually, the company was sold earlier this year to a nice exit, so it ended up working, but it took 15 years. The other lesson, it can take a while, okay, especially if you're in the B2B space. Anyone here in the B2B space? It can take a while. But if you can make it work and you can build up the business, it can be very steady revenues and a nice exit. Not everything is an Instagram, right? So the second key lesson from Aeroscout was that we raised too little money. Every time we were out raising money, we built revenue projections and projections for how much we're going to sell, when and to whom and how and all this stuff. And every time we were too optimistic, I think through 4 or 5 funding rounds. And going back, after about the 4th round, we're like going, shit, why did we not raise some more money? Lower the valuation a bit, have a bit more money in the bank, but not have to scramble, because what happens, especially if you're in the B2B space, where the sales cycle can be really quite long, much longer than you think. You always want it to be that much shorter. It always ends up being that much longer. In the B2B space, it's really important to be quite conservative about how long the sales are going to take, and therefore how long it's going to take for you to get revenues. Remember, there's also collections, right? So you make a sale, you have to deliver, then you have payment times, and then you actually collect and you have cash in the bank. So you have to, especially if you're in the B2B space, think carefully about that. And if you have the option, if you're lucky enough to have the option to raise a bit more money, maybe at a lower valuation, give yourself the extra cushion. It's probably worth it, because down the road you won't regret having a bit more breathing room to get things growing. So the third key thing about Aeroscout was that there are moments in a company's history that sort of change everything, and at the time usually at the time you have some sense of happening. So for us, it was when we did a deal with Cisco. So Cisco, as you know, was a big networking company. At that time, they had entered the Wi-Fi space. They were just recently entering the Wi-Fi space. Wi-Fi networking was getting big. They built their own product. Their own product didn't really succeed in the market, and Cisco, being a very smart company who I respect a lot, bought the main competitor that was beating their pants off. They just forked out $500 million and bought them, and so they became the de facto gorilla in the Wi-Fi space. And because our solution used Wi-Fi infrastructure for a lot of the backbone. Really the key thing that made it was this one deal that we did with Cisco to integrate with them, to have them as a strategic partner. We also took them on board as an investor, and you know, that sort of sealed that, you know, it was going to work. How well, we weren't sure, but the business was going to work because we had a really big partner behind us. So those deals are worth fighting for. It took a very long time to get there. So Aeroscout, I ran marketing and biz dev. Then I moved back to Latvia, and from Riga, I set up and ran EMEA sales. But then I joined a company based in the UK called Live Bookings, online restaurant reservations. If you're ever in the UK, they have a consumer website called Book a Table, which does restaurant reservations. So Live Bookings is a business that was formed from a merger of 3 other companies, one in the UK, one in Sweden, one in Germany, each of which had online restaurant reservations and electronic reservation book, which basically means, you know, how the restaurant manages its tables and its reservations. They had that software. So it was a merger of these 3. They put it together. They would raise some more money to grow the business. And the fact of the matter, if anyone's been near this space, is it's a pretty tough business because restaurants are actually very difficult customers. They're basically like, it's like selling to a lot of corner shops that make a lot of money, but they behave like corner shops. They don't have a lot of IT. The people who are making decisions don't have IT experience or knowledge, so they tend to make very emotional decisions about what they buy. They don't tend to be rational. And it's also a business where, as a salesperson, you can't schedule a sales meeting reliably, right? Because you're always last priority. Because if you schedule a meeting and the guy delivering fish hasn't turned up, you can bet your ass the manager is off going to get fish, because that's the top priority. So it's quite a difficult business with a high sales cost. And what we did in the end was we built a telesales operation. So I built a telesales operation in London that was selling over the phone, and it was something which everyone in the industry, everyone in the restaurant industry says, no one in the restaurant industry buys over the phone. You've got to be kidding. No one. You know, it's a relationship business, right? They're in the service business. They come and talk to you, so they're not going to buy over the phone. Forget it. And it does work, actually. It just needs some effort and the right people doing it, and we actually managed to get that off the ground. But it's also one of the lessons in thinking about, you know, it's important to have industry knowledge in these places and important to understand the industry, but there are times when someone as an outsider needs to come in and say, you know what, maybe we should really try this, right? So I'm not a restaurant guy. I didn't have a clue about how to run a restaurant, but all the people in the industry said that wouldn't work. So sometimes industry knowledge needs to be ignored, right? Obviously, it's hard to always tell when, but sometimes. The second big lesson I learned at Live Bookings, I ran marketing, biz dev, and product there, was that you have to kill old products. So I don't know if anyone here is in a business that's inherited some legacy products or products that have been running for a while and trying to get them going better. The advice is to kill things as fast as possible, because when I came to Live Bookings, they'd been merged. These 3 companies had been merged together already for about 3 years, and they had 3 different reservation books, 3 different sort of online bookings. There was some sort of light stuff over the top that kind of connected it, but underneath we were running 3 different databases, you know, all of that stuff. And it was a nightmare. It was a nightmare to manage and maintain. And every time we tried to pull something, all the sales guys would go, oh no, in Germany they're going to kill you if you pull this product. No, you can't do that, you can't do this, you can't do that. And the answer is you have to, because for companies like that that need to evolve, you know, you have to have the guts to kill these old products. So I left the company 2 years later, but just as I was leaving, we were finally killing the product, and actually it wasn't as bad as everyone said it would be, and they should have done it quite a lot earlier. So, live bookings. So after live bookings, I left and I started my own startup. It was called Amuse, and it was a digital loyalty program for restaurants, bars, and cafes. And now I thought I knew the restaurant business, right? I've been there for a whole 2 years, so I thought I knew the restaurant business, and of course I was wrong. I didn't know the restaurant business all that well, but I was wrong especially about one thing, which was that I started this business on my own. You know, figured I'd get it going, find some co-founders along the way, and didn't take off as fast as I wanted to. And what I found was that it's really hard to do this on your own. And if you've applied to any startup accelerators, as I'm sure a lot of you have in here, you'll find that accelerator programs are now very wary of taking on single-person teams. And I know exactly why. Because it's really bloody hard to do a startup on your own. So my advice to any of you who have a good idea is keep working at it until you find some people who are ready to quit their jobs or spend a lot of time working on it with you before you really go and do it. Because it's much, much harder on your own. Much harder. And your likelihood of raising money is a lot lower. So, so the other reason that Amuse didn't really take off was I ended up spending a shitload of time getting Tech Hub Riga set up. That took about 3 months of full-time work. But anyway, for those of you who have not been to Tech Hub Riga, we have a startup co-working space there, which is really pretty fucking cool, we think. And if you are coming to visit Riga, please come visit. You know, you're all friends. You're welcome to drop in for a day. If you're in Riga regularly, you can become an annual member and use that as your Riga working space. But we run a lot of events there, and so you can look up meetup.com/TechHubRiga or facebook.com/TechHubRiga, and you can find out all about what we do. We actually have workshops, tech workshops, Android workshops, gaming meetups, a general meetup once a month, which is every second Thursday of the month, Mobile Monday happening. So it's not that far to Riga, and we should be traveling up and down more often. But anyway, if you're up there, come visit us. So, 2 more sort of points in my bio around messages that I wanted to give before I let you all ask some questions. I worked for Startup Wise Guys this past spring, helping get the first program off the ground and working as lead mentor. And I have to say the Estonians have a really great startup community. They pulled together an amazing list of mentors. They also attracted a great set of teams, so 5 teams from outside Estonia, in fact outside the Baltics, and 3 Estonian teams. I was really pissed that they didn't pick any Latvian or Lithuanian teams. But anyway, a couple of key lessons from Wise Guys. So the first most important one was around focus. And I'm sure that lots of you have heard all this stuff about, you know, you really got to focus as a startup, blah, 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 and you hear it again and again and again. But it's really not bullshit. With all the 8 teams in Startup Wise Guys, pretty much every single conversation I had with every single team was about focus. Like, okay, you want to do this? So, which is your main target user? No, not that broad group, but which specific target user? Pick something really, really narrow, really concrete, some problem you're solving very obviously that is really visceral for that customer, and focus in on that. And solve that problem, make it as simple as possible so you can get minimum viable product as early as possible, and solve that product. Now, of course, the reaction sometimes is, well, but I need a really big target market, because no one's going to invest unless the market is huge, right? I need the $1 billion market. And the answer to that is, yes, if you want to build a big company, you do need like a $1 billion market and something big to aim at. But that doesn't mean you need to build everything for a $1 billion market day one. Day one, you need to focus on something really narrow and concrete, something where you can solve a problem. And the key is that you can conceptually connect that to a $1 billion market. right? So take that narrow niche, explain how you can do something fast for them, and then in an accelerator you need to build something quickly that you can do there. But you need to then link that in terms of, well, if we do this, then we've learned these things, and we can then target these customers who are similar, and then you build it up, and eventually you're talking about $1 billion market, right? So that's the key. And I just had this conversation again and again. Any conversation I have with startups, it's a lot of what I talk about. Really narrow it down, really focus on it, and win that space. There are very few exceptions. Probably the one exception to that rule is some companies that become platforms for other things, where you end up having to focus on quite a large market. But that's a very risky business model. There are not that many companies that pull it off. But the general advice is to really focus and nail a very specific market. And I mean, the other thing at Wise Guys, the same as any accelerator, it's pretty brutal. You need to be brutal early. You need to think yourselves about the advice you're getting and changing things early on, so you can learn fast. I think that's key, and that's why accelerators are useful for companies that can pivot quite quickly. So, lastly, I'll speak a few words about Creandum. So, I think everyone in this room knows who Spotify is as a company, even though I don't think they serve Lithuania yet, just like Latvia, right? We're off the target list right now.
You have Spotify in Latvia?
No, we don't. And I don't think it's coming anytime soon either. They have so many more big markets to tackle with their huge legal team. It'll come eventually. But Creandum was actually the first institutional investor in Spotify. It's an investment which will make their second funds, I'm sure, do extremely well. It's an example of the approach that they've taken, and why I actually picked working with Creandum as the VC firm I want to try and bring to the Baltics. So they knew the Creandum guys for, I think, 18 months before they invested. They got to know them early. They built up a relationship, and they worked very closely with them all the way through, after investment. And that's the Creandum approach. So it's a little different from some other VC firms that will do a lot of very small investments, wait to see which of those will survive, and then invest more money in the ones that survive. Creandum is not going to do that many investments, so you won't hear about 10 Baltic startups getting Creandum money. But the idea is to pick a small number and put money in them and really work with them and help them to grow and succeed. So the basic facts, it's an early stage investor, so seed and A rounds. Typically companies have prototypes, some user traction, some minimal market proof at least. So seed and A rounds, anything from 100,000 euros to a few million euros. Consumer internet, software, hardware, so pretty much the gamut of tech investments, but it's a tech focused company. So so that's sort of a little bit about startups, definitely not everything about startups, a little bit about startups, and interspersed with some background. So I'm happy to answer any questions, unless there's anything else you want. Yeah, any questions?
So when you were making a strategic partnership with Cisco, how did you make sure that they want you to succeed and not making this partnership to kill you or something like that?
Yeah, so the question is, how did we, when we were doing the partnership with Cisco, how did we make it so that they want us to succeed, not just kill us, right?
Yeah, they bought Flip cameras, the maker of Flip cameras, and they killed it. And they killed them.
Yeah, so the short answer is shit happens. And you can't, when you're dealing with a big company, there are no guarantees in the end that they will, end up holding their bargain. But the key thing in all the deals we did with bigger companies was to work really hard to try and find a reason for it being in their interest to continue working with you. And so structuring things so that on an ongoing basis not just the one guy that's the biz dev guy on their side, you know, has done a deal and that's great, but that there's a benefit for their salespeople, there's a benefit for their marketing people, there's a benefit for their branding, you know, whatever else. We need to find all the things so that the people who are actually delivering on whatever the partnership is are actually have an interest in doing that down the road, right? So in our case, it was a technology integration, so we had our engineers working with their engineers, and we had some knowledge about how to do this that they didn't have so good, and so there was an interest on their part in working with us to make sure that they're up to speed. We had actually some marketing insights, right? So we've been out in the market looking at applications for real-time location, as it was called, or is called, for basically asset tracking in many different market segments. I mean, I can tell you, I've had conversations with guys who have asked about whether they can track mariners, seamen inside a submarine, right? It turns out it's actually a problem, right? So they have this bloody huge nuclear submarine with, like, I don't know, 500 seamen on it, and the captain is not really sure where everyone is, and it's actually quite hard to manage. Well, with RFID and radio waves inside a submarine, it's a no-hoper, right? But we looked at many of these markets, and actually one of our value adds for Cisco was market knowledge, because they're a generalist networking provider. You know, they've got guys who are sort of in healthcare maybe and a bit in education, but most of them are just selling to any enterprise that has a, you know, big budget. And so this was one of our value adds. And so you need to line up as many of these as possible and structure the terms of the deal so that they have an interest in working with you. But the bottom line is, you know, shit can happen. Yeah.
Another question about dealing with big companies. How long did it take you to get a deal with Cisco? And what was like the approach during this?
So the question is about the time to do deals with big companies. So it does depend a bit on what kind of deal. So Cisco, the deal with Cisco was a technology integration, also tied with an investment, which we considered to be another reason, I guess, for them to stick around, was they then had a stake in our business. So that took, I don't know, probably a year from the day we started talking about some relationship until the day we got the deal signed. So it definitely takes a while in a big company. I'll give you another example. So I did a reseller deal with IBM. So IBM signed a contract that they will resell Aeroscout's products. It was the first big reseller deal we did. It took me, I think, 3 years to get that reseller deal. And you know how long it took for the actual first dollar of sales to come through IBM? Another 3 years. So it would have been much wiser not to bother the hell with IBM for a long time until we were much closer. So it can take a long time with big companies. And you know, one of the other lessons with a company like IBM was if you're looking at a reseller, so we had a business model where they would resell our product and bundle it with other things, with services and delivery and so forth. That business model is one where the reseller, you have to assume that a reseller will, the first deal you basically have to give them on a plate. You have to give them customers on a plate before they'll really do a decent reseller deal with you and follow through, right? Because we were kind of assuming, well, we do a deal with IBM and they've got a shitload of salespeople everywhere and I'm sure they can sell the stuff, right? But it turns out that their salespeople have lots of other things to sell. And this is a new product, it's complicated, it's, you know, I don't really get it. So they just didn't do any sales, right? Whereas other resellers, much smaller, that we were engaged with more closely, you know, were actually doing sales. So so with big companies, you need to remember that it takes a lot of energy and activity to get them rolling. So, and even signing the deal is not necessarily actually has any value, except for PR and maybe some fundraising value. Any others?
I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
As a Latvian, what do you think, which country, Lithuanian or Latvia, is better in startup scene? And I'd like to ask you to be like...
That's a loaded question, because I actually want to get out of this room alive.
Please, please be honest, but have in mind that you have 50 Lithuanians around, so...
So the question, for those of you who have guns under your shirts, is which startup scene is better, Latvia or Lithuania? And I think I'm going to kind of duck the question in some sense, because I actually think they're different in a lot of senses.
When I asked Andris the same, he said that he loves all countries. So
Yeah, well, he's Finnish. They're really friendly, nice, diplomatic people, right? So, so the answer is, I think they're different. I think the Latvian startup scene is actually the newest, the shortest sort of lived of all three Baltic states. So I think you had, and certainly the Estonians had things going earlier in a bigger way than Latvia did. I mean, 18 months ago, it was still virtually a desert in startup land in Latvia. So it's grown very quickly. It's grown faster, I think, on some consumer internet type products. And I think Latvia is behind on some of the harder technology stuff. You're certainly ahead on the mobile apps in lots of ways, and gaming, I think. So I think it varies sort of where you talk about it. I don't know if I can make a blanket comparison. The bottom line is that none of these three states has had a huge amount of success, unless you accept Skype. GetJar is successful. GetJar is now an American company to a large extent. They've successfully transitioned to America, which is great. But there's a handful of successes, and you can't yet say that any of these three countries has got a real ecosystem that's really buzzing. I think Estonia is closest. They have, if you compare number of funding rounds of companies that have matured to the point where they're getting follow-on A rounds and B rounds, Estonia has the biggest cluster, right? So in terms of a number of companies that have all got like $1 million, $2 million kind of rounds, they're definitely further. So we have a ways to go, but there's a lot of potential. So I ducked the question.
And one more question as a VC for you is about traction in countries and markets like Lithuania and Latvia. Antti mentioned before that you had some startups from Lithuania who said that almost half of population of Lithuania had their product tested, and that it doesn't mean that other markets will use that product. Do you think as a VC, and if Lithuanian startup approaches you with traffic from only Lithuanian, are you willing to invest or discuss about investments? Or you have to try to go to global market before you go to VCs?
So I think the answer is, as always, it depends. But it depends on some specific things. So I think if you're in the consumer internet space, I would say that local market is very irrelevant. It's not relevant because if you're in the consumer internet space, I'd rather see you spend the same time trying to get consumers in the US or in the UK, using this product, than spend time getting Lithuanian users using the product, right? If you're in the business-to-business market, maybe a little different, because it may be that, so firstly you may need direct sales, right, to actually close a deal, and it's pretty hard early on to fly to the US or the UK and actually do real deals and have them stick with companies. You typically, for an enterprise product of some kind, you need to have some presence on the ground, and most startups in the early days won't have the funding to do that. And as long as the kind of businesses you're selling to translate reasonably well, then traction locally with B2B definitely has some value. But I'd say a lot less with consumer products. The other thing is it also depends on what your advantage is in the market, and whether we'd see that advantage being location specific. So if you're dependent on specifics of the Lithuanian market for your success, then we can be much less sure whether you're actually likely to have those advantages elsewhere, right? And then the story doesn't really help.
Okay. Any more questions?
Can you,
Okay.
no. Can you name any hot startup from this region?
Can I name any hot startups?
Yeah, I know you don't want to give out trade secrets, but
there are quite a few startups that have some good traction. So in Lithuania, probably one of the startups that has the best traction is Eskimi. There you go. So,
But do you think Eskimo won't get like smashed by Facebook when?
Good question. They could do. They could do. But they certainly demonstrated their ability to scale a business in their particular markets, to the first level at least. So in Latvia there are some good up-and-coming consumer internet startups, Cobook and Infogram. I know them both well. If you use a Mac, the Cobook contact address book app is bloody brilliant. And also Selfie, which is a startup highway brand.